The Bible reading is from Revelation 6. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to make peace, to take peace from the earth, and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, "A liter of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 liters of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and wine." When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed as they had been was completed. I watched as he opened the 6th seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as late figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded like a scroll rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us, hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?"
So, welcome to our service today. We've got a bit of a shortened service for you, mainly because I forgot to push the record button of the service itself. So, you're not going to get music and some of the other things that were in the service, but at least we thought we would catch up just with the message that God gave us for this morning. So, when we look at the book of Revelation, one of the first things we've got to understand is that the book is actually broken up into 7 parallel parts, and each part starts with the reflection on the coming of Christ and ends up with the return of Christ. So it deals with the period in between the first and the second coming of Christ, 7 times over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is really the time of the church. The church is living between the fact that Jesus came and that Jesus is coming back. And so these 7 repetitions in the book of Revelation gives us 7 angles on the same event of how the church lives within this time between the first and second coming of Jesus. And the background to our passage is that we have in the beginning, in the first 3 chapters, we've got a picture of Christ standing amongst the 7 churches, and he is present in his church, and he's addressing his church, pointing out things that are good and things that are bad in his church. And then in chapters 4 and 5, we've got a vision of the throne of God, and it ultimately culminates on the Lamb going onto the throne and taking a scroll and breaking the seals of the scroll. The idea here is that the scroll represents the unfolding of history, and the breaking of the seals is how God intervenes or how God engages in this unfolding historical development between the first and second coming of Jesus. So in chapter 6, it starts off by talking about these horsemen. It says, "Then I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 creatures saying, 'Come,' and I looked, and there before me was a white horse." Now, white throughout the whole book of Revelation is always associated with God, with Jesus. And this white horse comes out, and there's a rider on him who held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror, bent on conquest. So most probably the vision here is about Christ still moving out, conquering through his powerful word, bringing people into to become subjects of the new kingdom. He is the conqueror, he is the victor. Now in the world, people often tell us that the church is dying and the church is going under and all kinds of ideas, but we need to refocus, understanding that Christ is still on his victory, busy with his victory, busy with his conquest, that nothing can stop the gospel from reaching people and bringing them over into the kingdom of light. Sometimes we may actually think that people are really, really antagonistic to the gospel. And at times it's those very people that give us the hardest times that are overcome by the message of Jesus. I remember when I was during the time of the war on the border in South Africa as a chaplain, and one of the guys that really gave me a hard time. Every time I wanted to do something, if I needed a vehicle, he would just not refuse to give it to me. Whenever I came in, he would mock me or tell all kinds of horrible jokes just because I was there. And I left after a couple of months. I went back, and then a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from him to tell me, "I just wanted to tell you that I had become a Christian." So this is the guy that gave me a really hard time, and yet ultimately God's powerful word and message conquered his heart. Then it talks about the second horse that goes out. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. And the idea here is that it speaks here about violence being a constituent, being a real part of how the world works. But more probably here also following the white horse is that this talks about the physical persecution of those who belong to God. Those times when we get mocked or isolated, or, when you say that you go to church or something and the conversation just stops and becomes awkward, or actually physical, real persecution where people are still killed today in many places across the world. And so this is a fiery red horse. And it says to the church that though you have become part of this people that have been conquered by the word of Jesus, there's another horse that comes and will trample over you, and that's the horse, the red horse that comes with persecution and the suffering that goes with that. Followed by that is a third horse. Then the Lamb opened the third seal, and I heard the third living creature say, "Come," and I asked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, "A liter of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 liters of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." The symbol here talks of real economic hardship. So somebody can work a whole day and get barely enough to survive for one person, never mind a family. And it is so that at oftentimes that Christians end up suffering all kinds of economic hardships. When you don't go along with the way the boss wants to things to happen, when you resist the office parties and the things that go on there, oftentimes you may find that you are not in the in crowd, that you are left on the outside, that you're not promoted. That can so easily happen. In the time of Revelation, the Christians suffered because they couldn't belong to the trade unions, and because the trade unions all had their own private god that they worshipped. If you didn't belong to the trade union, then you couldn't actually take part in the whole economic activity of the city. So every group had its own trade unions, the silversmiths and the people who did woodwork. They all had their own unions, and whatever your trade was, you were just excommunicated if you didn't worship the god of that trade union. And so that happened to a lot of Christians. So here we have real economic hardship. Now, we know that the country is facing kind of real economic hardship at the moment, and that Christians are not immune to that, that it's part of the way in which we suffer along with the world. Now, it says here that do not damage the oil and the wine. On the other hand, the image here wants to tell us that while some people are really suffering, others are living in luxury. Then we're looking at the fourth horse. It says, when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. Then we read that there's a pale horse. Its rider's named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. The overall impression here is that everything in the world is actually aligned against us. People kill each other. Famine, where we don't get enough food. The very nature is set up to try and get us. As this idea that we see now, this virus exploding across the world. And it's just so that we got to realize that within this world, that it's marked by death. That death is this horse that comes galloping right over even we who are gathered together as Christians. And that death sweeps behind it, and it says here, a quarter of the people are taken in. The idea that not everybody dies, but at one time, but consistently people fall over to the clutches of death. And that's true for us as well, that we live in a world where we know that ultimately death will get us. Now, when we turn to the fifth seal, I saw that under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. They called out in a loud voice, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed as they had been was completed. It's interesting that here we've got the church crying out and saying, how long, God, before we are avenged? And it sounds kind of funny because we expect the church to just say, Lord, forgive them or bless them. Why is the church here calling out for vengeance? Well, it sets in the context that there is a final judgment where God actually deals with wickedness and evil. That evil can be forgiven, evil can be done away with, but evil cannot be maintained in the presence of the Holy God of love. And that when God comes back, that there will be an exposing of that what is evil and a judging of that which is evil, that God will discard that. And here the church, who has suffered all kinds of horrible things done to it, is crying out and said, Lord, do not let evil have the final say. How long? Until things are put right, until things are changed, until evil is destroyed, until what's been done to us is not treated as if it's okay, until there's a day of judgment. And the response here is that the church has got to wait because there's still some more suffering to be done for the sake of the world. That's the interesting thing, that God keeps the church here under these conditions where it suffers, and yet it keeps the church in the world to suffer that for the sake of the white horse that's still going out, conquering, bringing people into the kingdom of light. And so the church continues to suffer in this process for the sake of the world. Then suddenly it switches over to I watched as he opened the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to the earth as late figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The sky receded like a scroll rolling up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Now, that's a good example here of the end of time that's been spoken here. The big day of Jesus returning, the big day of judgment, the coming of the day of the Lord. And some people read the book of Revelation, and it starts as a kind of a predictions of what will happen, and they just start reading from chapter 1 onwards and seeing everything following in sequence. But we know, excuse me, some big sneezes. Luckily, we are in virtual reality, so you are saved from that. So some people think there's all these kind of predictions, and they try and build a pattern right up to the end. But we actually see here that the world ends, because when the sky is rolled up like a scroll and the stars fall, everything, and God comes in judgment, that is the end of the world. And there's a picture of people when they are confronted with the coming of the holy God of love, that they are hiding in caves, and they try and flee away from God. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man hid in caves among the rocks of the mountains, and they called to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Who can stand when God comes to deal with evil? Who of us can stand when God comes in judgment? Now, we need to have this perspective of the fact that God does not accommodate sin, that he ultimately will deal with wickedness. But the emphasis in the book of Revelation is not on the judgment, but it is on the fact that within this domain, God is actually keeping his people. So if you go over to Revelation chapter 7, it starts speaking about, while these are the people, the mighty, the powerful, and even the slaves and the weak, but people who have given themselves over into wickedness as they fear the coming of God. Chapter 7 shifts the cameras onto the Christians, and it speaks about the 144,000 who are sealed with the sign of the Lamb. Now, the 144,000 here is a symbol for the whole church, the people of God, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So we've got the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. 12 times 12 gives us 144. The 1,000 is used in Revelation and other places as a symbol of completeness, of wholeness, kind of a perfect cube, 10 by 10 by 10. And it says here the 144,000 is a symbol of all the people, all the believers from the Old Testament times, the people of God from the Old Testament times, and the people of God from the New Testament times, all being brought together and all being saved, and not one of them missing. Now, it's not a literal 144,000. If some of you had Jehovah's knock on your door, you would have heard them talking about a real, literal 144,000. They were quite big on it, until they got numbers that went beyond that. And then they sort of had to create a second-class heaven for the rest that we're going to follow. But we see that the 144,000, this symbol moves over, and the cameras zoom out, as it were, and we read, "After this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and in the front of the Lamb. And they were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, "Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb." And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell down on their faces before the throne and worshiped God, saying, "Amen. Praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever." And one of the elders asked me, "These in white robes, who are they and where did they come from?" I answered, "Sir, you know." And he said, "They are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." So these are the people that have suffered. These are the people who are not good in and of themselves because they needed to wash their robes through what Christ has done for them. Naturally broken, fallen, evil, but it's what Christ has done for them that have brought forgiveness to them. They have become white because they have trusted in what Jesus did for them. And it says, "And they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will spread his tent over them. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat upon them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes." Now we're talking about a church in the midst of suffering, in the midst of a broken world, and a church where these horses of the apocalypse come and they run over it, and many people are hurt in the process. And yet is this message that in the midst of the turmoil and the brokenness of this world, in the midst of the evil that stalks the children of God, that ultimately God will take his people and that he will bring them to a place where they will never hurt again, where he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, where he will spread his powerful presence over them like a tent and protect them and keep them. In fact, actually what it says is that nothing can take us out of God's care in the midst of this. So the church is in the world, the church suffers in the world, suffers at the hands of the world, suffers as it gives itself in love to the world to continue God's business. In a sense, we can say that the white horse on which the conqueror rides into the world to bring the message of salvation, to conquer people with the good news of what Jesus has done for them, that the church is the horse and the rider is Jesus, that the church is God's way of going out into the world and conquering and reaching people with his love. And in the process, the church suffers at the hands of the world, but it does that because it serves the God of love, who does not want people to stand before him in the great day of his wrath and anger against all that is evil. But he wants them to come to a place where their robes can be washed in the blood of the Lamb, where they can be forgiven and made new and cleansed and become God's children in all its fullness. That's our message for today. And I'm sorry about that you missed out on some of the great singing and some of the prayers and stuff. Hopefully next week we'll make a point and we'll push that record button, but at least you got something. So we trust that you are doing well and that you will be blessed by this message, and that this message will give you hope as we all go through this really tough time together. Thank you very much.